Hello, my Grots and Gets. Welcome back to Happy Crumping War Gaming. Today, I'm going to start breaking it down on your faction. How do you build your army? So I've been getting a lot of questions in the Discord. I've been getting some DMs. I've been getting some emails where people are really struggling to figure out exactly how to create their game plan and actually how to create their army. So last week we did a really solid video. And if you haven't seen it, we also did a teaching stream specifically on how to implement a game plan. And people really grasped the idea and they gravitated towards the concept. But a lot of people are failing in the list building step of how to build an army that can execute said game plan. So what I really wanted to do today is I'm going to break down the individual steps that you need to do to make your faction, regardless of which faction it is, a successful competitive army. And there's a few rules that we need to understand. So let's get to the video's purpose, baby. First off, this video's purpose, we are optimizing your army for competitive play. This does not mean that we're making a unfun to play against army. This does not mean that we're trying to abuse anything. This is how we're going to take your army, regardless of which army it is, and we are going to make it a strong, competitively viable army. And yes, every single army in the entire game can be competitive. When you look at win rates on, Stat Check or any of these other people who compile the actual win rates, even the armies that are not doing super well does not mean that they cannot be won with. As a matter of fact, as silly as it is, as dumb as and horrible as the detachment is, the single worst detachment that Games Workshop has ever made, the Null Maiden Vigil, has won a GT, which is stupid and it should not have happened. And I believe there was a lot of luck involved in it. But it does go to show you that literally every single army in the game can be competitive if you build it correctly. So, yes, some of the armies in the game have inherent advantages. Some armies are just straight up better than others. And one of the beautiful things about the current edition of Warhammer 40,000 is that Games Workshop is doing a really good job about constantly balancing the game to make sure that any of the runaway super really good armies are reined in, and some of the armies that are really struggling are getting a big leg up. So previously in the edition, you had Dark Eldar that were all the way down in the 30s for a win rate, which is astronomically low, and lo and behold, GW fixed it. They went ahead and released a new detachment for everyone so that now Dark Eldar are actually one of the better armies in the game. So it's actually very fantastic how that works. So even if your army is really suffering right now, despair not, because Games Workshop has been shown that they are willing to fix it. Anyway, any army gets to win when they are piloted correctly, as we just explained with the Null Maiden Vigil, and that's how we're going to learn to do today. So let's get into it. What is step one of building your army and getting it prepped for competitive play? It is identifying your army role. Number one question is, what is your army rule and how does it synergize with your units? When you know what your army rule is and how it synergizes with any unit in the codex, it will tell you exactly, it'll give you the blueprint for what you're looking to build around. So for example, let me give you a breakdown. Oath of the Moment from Space Marines. At the beginning of the phase, you get to select one enemy unit and your entire army gets full rerolls hits against that unit. What does that immediately tell us about each and every single Space Marine out there? Every Space Marine army has one thing in common, and there's lots of very different Space Marine armies. One thing they have in common is that they are very good at focus firing down a single enemy unit. That is good. That lets you know that Space Marine's strength is focus firing down a unit. It also knows that at any point in time, you can give full rerolls to any unit or every unit against one specific enemy unit, which means you can afford potentially, I'm not saying you would, to take units that don't necessarily have very good hit profiles. So perhaps it's a unit that only hits on 4s, but if you can, on demand, give them reroll hit rolls against the unit you really need them to have reroll hit rolls against, well, perhaps then you can help certain units that would otherwise lag a little bit. It also lets you know that if you have units that have sustained hits, lethal hits, these types of things, that you can always use Oath of the Moment to help them fish for better rolls. So it gives you an idea of what style units that you're going to want to be able to build. Let's give a few more examples here. Example 1, Custodes have Martial Katas. Essentially what that is, at every fight phase, you're going to get to choose either sustained hits one or lethal hits on that unit, on each individual unit in the army. What does that tell us, guys? That tells us that the army rule for Custodes is they love freaking melee. They want to be in melee. It doesn't tell us that they hate shooting, but it does tell us they love melee. So that's immediately going to get your brain working and thinking, okay, cool, this is something that I need to consider. I'm building an army that wants melee. Done. You start there. Now, one other example, then we'll move on. Fate dice for the Eldar. The Fate dice, you get to replace a certain dice with a predetermined dice roll. So at the beginning of the game, they'll roll like 6 dice, and then whatever the face value of those dice is, they get to replace dice rolls later on in the game with those dice. What does that tell me when I'm just thinking, all right, bare bones, what does Eldar do? Eldar is a reliable army. When they need to make the charge, when they have to make the damage roll of 6, they can do it. That's what Eldar does. Same thing as Sisters of Battle, by the way. So it tells us it is a very reliable army, and that gives you an idea of what you're going to be building into. It lets you know that you're not asking for chance. All right. Step number 2, we've identified our army rule and we've identified what that really wants us to kind of lean into. Now let's talk about the detachment rule. So what does our detachment rule tell us? Does it support the army rule? Does it oppose the army rule? Does it cover weaknesses in our army rule? So your detachment rule will further refine the style of units that you're going to want to be looking at as far as your army is concerned. Some armies have detachments that are not supportive of the army rule at all. Let me give you a few examples of things that do support the army rules. So, Eldar. We already know that their army rule is going to be the ability to get fate dice that can make things really, really reliable. But then you look at what their detachment rule is. Eldar get to reroll 1 hit and 1 wound roll per activation per unit. This is insane. So when you combine the fact that every single unit gets to reroll 1 hit roll and 1 wound roll, with the fact that you can always replace a dice with a dice of a predetermined value, this makes units in this army unbelievably reliable. It more or less guarantees that every time you activate, you will be getting damage through. It means that every single time you need to make a charge, you probably can make the charge. When you really need to make a save, you can probably make a save. It also tells you that since you get to already reroll 1 hit and wound roll, you already know that you're probably not going to be needing to use your predetermined fate dice for hits and wounds because you have that built in already. So it tells us that this army, it's reliable. It does what you ask the units to do. It's very challenging, not saying it's impossible, but it is very challenging for them to get screwed by dice. Then, here's another example. We have Talons of the Emperor. Now, this is one of the Custodes detachments. Some Sisters of Silence will give a 5-up feel no pain against mortals and cyclic attacks to Custode models. This is a very big deal. So this is an example of a detachment rule that covers up a weakness in the army. It's not necessarily super supportive of the army's rule, but it does cover up a weakness that the army otherwise wouldn't have. So Custodes in particular are very vulnerable to mortal wound style damage because they are very elite units and they have great saving profiles. But once you do mortal wounds, they just get knocked over, and that can tend to cause more damage to Custodes than it would to other armies. So this is a huge ability to shore up a weakness. So that lets you know that immediately, right off the bat, Talons of the Emperor is fixing a weakness in Custodes, so it is making a balanced army. That's what it's doing. All right, let's go on to step 3. Now, what do we know all about our army? So we're going to wrap these things together, okay? Eldar, for example, here. They love variable damage, they love MSU units, and they love 4-up style saves. Let me break this down for you. They love variable damage because if it's a d6 plus 2 damage or something like that, they can always just put a little dice down to make it a damage 8. So if the damage goes through, they can reliably make it a devastating blow. They love MSU units. What does MSU mean? It means minimum sized unit. So the reason why they love MSU units is because each unit gets to reroll 1 hit and 1 wound roll. This also means that they like elite style damage because you always get to reroll 1 hit and 1 wound roll. And then we know that they love 4-up invulnerable style saves simply because they always have the ability to take a dice from their little, fate dice pool and go, "Beep, I'm going to use this now." So let's say they have, some really, really big nasty, and your opponent's going to shoot a Tyrannofex into it, which is going to be crazy damage. Well, your opponent never has to worry about the Tyrannofex popping off and causing 12 damage to your Warwalker or your Avatar or your whatever, because they're just going to say, cool, I'm going to take this Fate Dice and say you don't get to do damage. It is a very, very powerful ability that Eldar do. So when they're wanting to build armies, a lot of times they like including variable damage. They love including MSU units, and they love these big units that tend to be vulnerable but have a good 4-up invulnerable save. So these are the things that they adore. Now, what have we learned about Custodes so far? Just because these are the 2 armies we've really mainly been talking about. They love melee. We know that from their martial kata ability, and they can have a solid defense against mortal wounds. Not to mention you stack that with their normal defensive. So this army, Talons of the Emperor, is going to hit very, very hard, and they're also going to be very, very tough. That means that all of our units will be able to fill multiple roles, which is really important to know. So let's move on to step 4. So that step 3 is just combining what we already know about our armies, and we're going to move on to step 4 now. All right, cool. Enhancements and stratagems. So once you get the army rule and the detachment rule, now you got to look at the enhancements and the stratagems. And what do the enhancements and the stratagems tell you that the detachment really, really wants you to do? It's super important. It's going to tell you exactly what style of units to put in your army. If your stratagems support only one type of unit, but your army doesn't want that type of unit, it's probably not the detachment that you're going to build a very good army with. I'm going to use the example of the Null Maiden Vigil, which once again is the worst detachment that Games Workshop has ever made, but it's a great example to basically illustrate my point. So, the Custodes army rule makes them really, really good in melee. Null Maiden Vigil strats and the Detachment rule only support Sisters of Silence units, which doesn't do anything to help the Custodes, which is what the army really wants to be pushing due to the army rule. So chances are really low you're ever going to make a good Null Maiden Vigil army. Now, one guy has performed well Null Maiden Vigil. It wasn't a good army. He just performed well with it, all right? Maybe he's a great player and he also got lucky. That doesn't mean that this is actually a great Custodes army. Just to head off the comments that are going to come down in the chat. Anything could happen in 40k, okay? But that would be an example of a detachment that has anti-synergy with the army in general, because it's making you not want to take your best units because there's nothing you can do for your best units in this detachment. Then here's another example of an army that shows synergy with specific units. So you've got Bully Boys. Bully Boys, for example, has a bunch of stratagems and enhancements, and those enhancements and stratagems only affect knobs and mega knob units. So if we wanted to look at a Bully Boy style army, we know for a fact that we are going to want to be taking knobs and mega knobs because all of our stratagems basically only affect those units. So that detachment is really pushing those style units. So if you were going to build a Bully Boy army, you can pretty much be assured that you're going to be wanting to take 3 units of knobs and probably 3 units of mega knobs. Let's move on into step 5. All right, now we're going to get a little bit deeper into the idea of units. What units do you want in your detachment? We kind of introduced it a little bit previously with Bully Boy. Now, some detachments are broadly just great for all freaking units in the game. This is really true. This is why we see Space Marines Gladius being run in Dark Angels, and we see Gladius being run with Blood Angels, and we see Gladius being run with Black Templars. It's because Gladius, the detachment for Space Marines, all of its strats apply to pretty much every unit in the army. So it is very broad in its application. It can benefit more or less any unit in any of the codexes, which is very, very powerful. Then we can see other examples of detachments that are going to benefit every single unit. And these are just generally going to be the better detachments because it gives you more flexibility. Well, you've got Liberator Assault Group from the Blood Angels, which gives everyone +2 strength, +1 attack on the charge. That affects everyone. And when you look at the strats can affect more or less every unit in the codex. You've got War Horde for the Orcs, which gives everyone sustained hits 1, and all the stratagems can be used on every single unit in the codex, except for 1, which can't be used on monsters and vehicles, but that's okay. So these are very broad in their applications, which gives you a ton of flexibility in the way that you want to build your list. Then we have some detachments that are extremely narrow, and this doesn't mean they're bad, by the way. Sometimes these narrow detachments can even be better than the broad detachments, but they do need to be built in very, very specific ways. So, for example, we just spoke about Bully Boys, but we can also speak about the Angelic Host, which is the new detachment from the Blood Angels. The Angelic Host detachments, or the stratagems and the detachments, rule only work on jump pack units. So basically, any unit you bring into an army that is Angelic Host that doesn't have a jump pack is going to have 0 support, which typically will decrease their usefulness, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are useless, as we'll see on the next slide. So the strats and the detachment rule plus the army rule combine, giving you the instructions on how exactly you want to build your army. Now let's put it all together. How do specific units go in an army? Some of the units in the codex or in the detachment or whatever are just good, regardless of what detachment you're going to put them in. You can say things like the Accursed Cultist Blob for Chaos Space Marines, especially when you combine them with the Dark Commune. That unit is good in any detachment. But there's some detachments that it's going to be better in. For example, it might be better in Renegade Raiders, where you can give it advance in charge, and you can give them bonus AP when they're attacking things on objectives. Perhaps they're better in the Cult Demagogue, or I think that's the name of the Cults detachment, where you can give them full rerolls to hit and wound. So these detachments are specifically instructing you, take a Cursed Cultist, even though any detachment could be like, hey, I can take a Cursed Cultist in, because they're just generally a good unit. Then you've got Flash Kits for the Orcs. Every single Orc detachment, regardless of how you're running them, likes Flash Kits, because they're just a good, solid unit. However, if you look at Warhorde, it can give you a little bit more support for the flash kits than any of the other detachments could. Because Warhorde, when they run into melee, they get exploding sixes, so they get sustained hits 1. And you can give them access to things like -1 to be wounded. So there are ways that you can support the flash kits even more in Warhorde. Now, that would, of course, compete with your ability to use that strat on other units, but the detachment gives them a little bit of a benefit, even though they're good in any detachment. Then we have a good example, JPI, or Jump Pack Assault Intercessors. These guys are rock stars in any detachment. It's 80 points for a unit that moves 12. It's got power armor. It might not hit super hard, but it hits kind of hard. They're a great little skirmishing unit. But once you start putting them in specific detachments, you can think Liberator Assault Group for the Blood Angels. Now when they charge, they get +1 attack and +2 strength. They get access to lethal and lance as stratagems. So they start getting turbocharged. So it really tells you, hey, this good unit that's good anywhere becomes much better in my detachment. Definitely take a look at it. So when you are getting a specific detachment, what I want you to ask the question is, what units are just generally good everywhere that could become even better in this detachment? Then you have some units that are just not good, but they become exceptionally good in very specific detachments. The one I'm thinking about right now would be your Centurion Devastators in Vanguard. Because this was really popularized by John Lennon, I believe. So shout out to that guy. He's a rock star, by the way. Also, super nice guy. Like, and it's not even fake. I've met him in real life several times. Dude rocks. Dude rocks. So anyway, Centurion Devastators. These guys are really, really good in Vanguard, even though they typically suck. So what makes them good in Vanguard? Well, let's identify what that unit's weakness is. They only move 4 inches and they don't have deep strike. So how the heck do you get them where you need them to be on the board? It becomes exceptionally challenging. You could take a unit of 2 and they could go, oh, I don't know, in certain transports, but that doesn't really help you all that much. So you really want a max-sized unit to be able to actually utilize all of their abilities and their damage output, but you got to get them somewhere. Well, Vanguard solves that equation by giving you a stratagem for uppy downy, which will allow you to pick your units up into reserves and bring them back down next turn. Couple that, but remember, they still don't have deep strike, so they would have to do that in coming in from strat reserves. So how do we fix that? Well, what John Lennon did is he says, oh, well, you got Uriel Ventress, who can give a unit deep strike. So he takes Uriel Ventress and the Centurion Devastators in Vanguard, and then suddenly they give the Centurions the deep strike keyword, and then they are able to be picked up and put back down, and they can get mobile wherever they need to be. This is how you take a unit that is in appearances kind of bad, but in a very specific scenario, very, very good. So when you're looking through your detachments, what I want you to look at is the stratagems, the enhancements, the detachment rule, and how would that apply to some of the less seen units in the codex? Because you already know that you can enhance the already good units, but how could we potentially take some less good units and make them very, very good in our specific detachment? So we don't see Inceptors very often in Space Marines right now either, simply because they are too expensive for being what is effectively a suicide squad. Well, now in the angelic host for Blood Angels, since they have uppy downy for 2 units with jump pack units, suddenly they become much better in that detachment because they don't have to be a suicide unit, and you can use their 3-inch deep strike multiple times a game that way. So what you can do is you just literally look at units, and they're always going to the 4 categories that make a unit good or bad are delivery, how do they get to where they're going? Damage, how much damage do they deal? Defense, how hard are they to kill? And then OC, can they hold an objective? Those are the 4 categories that make our units good or really bad. I mean, I guess maybe that's a little bit of a simplified way to say it, but these are what makes our units effective. So we ask ourselves, what does our attachment detachment do for these specific units? If you do that, then you will be guided while you're trying to make a really good army. If you're asking yourself the question, hey, does a Redemptor Dreadnought look good in your army? Well, just ask yourself the question. Do I have any strats that can support that Redemptor Dreadnought? Can I improve the mobility, the damage, the defense, or the OC of that Dreadnought? Well, and if the answer to all of those questions are no, then the Redemptor Dreadnought probably has no place in that detachment, unless you just want a generally good unit to fill up points. So with that, this is going to be the guide to how to make your competitive list work even better regardless of what army you're playing. Identify your army rule, identify your detachment rule, and then identify what the strats and the enhancements are telling you to do, and then build your army based off of those 3 things. If you guys enjoyed this video, hit the like, subscribe, share with your friends, and I'll be back with another one helping you guys master the game of 40k so that we can all crump our foes together and just have a great freaking time. All right, until next time, bye bye.